Combining high-level global economic policy with poetry isn't exactly something you see every day, right? But today, we're jumping right into how an expert in global economic policy makes a fascinating and actually highly practical case for poetry as a tool for sustainable development. Welcome to This Explainer. By the end of our time today, you are going to see the everyday language you use in a completely new light.
Okay, so at first glance, the deeply emotional art of poetry and the super rigid world of global socioeconomic policy seem, well, completely unrelated. On one hand, we have poetry, a realm of raw emotions, beautifully chosen words, and human healing. And then, on the other hand, we have economic policy, a world totally dominated by hard data, systemic structure, and the mechanics of sustainable development. Usually, we keep these worlds strictly separated. The poets stay in the arts department, the policy wonks stay in government buildings, and honestly, they rarely even share a coffee break.
But that separation raises a really provocative question. Can poetry actually shape sustainable global development? I mean, what if the very words we choose to speak, the artistic expressions we share, could directly influence shared global prosperity and unite diverse populations? It sounds almost too idealistic, doesn't it? But as we'll see from the source material we're unpacking today, this isn't just some romantic notion. It is a highly practical strategy.
To really understand this unexpected connection, we have to look at the architect behind it all, Oluyomi Ola David. She is proudly Nigerian, and while she spends her days crunching massive amounts of numbers to influence high-level global strategy, her absolute foundational motivation is a profound love for people. She isn't just staring at spreadsheets, she is deeply concerned with global development and actual lived human transformation. Furthermore, she is driven by her faith and a strong belief in a ruling Father God who guides her work as she focuses on generating real-world solutions. So what we have here is a highly analytical strategist whose core identity is just deeply, deeply rooted in humanity. And just look at her extensive archive of articles. The sheer contrast in her body of work is staggering. She writes extensively on incredibly complex, heavy socioeconomic topics. We are talking about deep dives titled Kidneys and the Global Economy, the drawbacks of premature deindustrialization, and choosing to challenge time poverty. I mean, that is serious macroeconomic analysis. But right alongside those dense pieces, you'll find her artistic focus. She writes about how poetry is good for development. She shares insights for World Poetry Day, and she talks about healing hearts that bleed. Seeing these two focuses sitting side by side fundamentally challenges all our assumptions about what a policy expert is supposed to sound like. Which naturally makes you wonder, why on earth does a policy strategist turn to poetry? Why would someone so entrenched in policy strategy, someone who literally analyzes deindustrialization for a living, suddenly advocate for the literary arts to solve global underdevelopment? Well, the answer is that she sees something in the power of words that standard data models just completely miss. She recognizes that before you can ever change a policy, you have to change a mindset. And to change a mindset, you need language that resonates. Let's look at exactly how she articulates this in her own writing. She begins one of her poems by pointing out the historical, functional utility of writers. She writes, with thoughts sometimes deep like sea, with bright lamps that help us see, with spoken lines that clarify paths for our feet, do literary sages through ages greet. She isn't just describing pretty words here. In a world that is so often darkened by incredibly complex global issues, she's arguing that poetry acts as a literal light that clarifies the paths we need to take. It actually provides the vision that has to perceive the policy itself. Then, she shifts gears to the active, real-world power of these words, saying, words that give hope to our poor and liberate us to soar, calm storms that rage, stirring love and not hate. Notice the action verbs she's using there. Words give hope. Words liberate. Words calm storms. In the realm of global development, poverty and conflict are the ultimate storms, right? She's making the case that uplifting language is the initial, required force to calm that socioeconomic turbulence. Because let's be real, you cannot legislate peace if the prevailing language on the ground is just stirring up hate. And this brilliantly illustrates her ultimate conclusion on the purpose of art. She writes that words must open blind eyes to united diversity, and shuts out abusive humanity. Heal hearts that bleed is all the poetry we may need. Ultimately, she views poetry not just as some aesthetic art form, but as an active healing mechanism. It unites diverse groups, and it actively shuts out the abuse of humanity. If development is fundamentally about improving the human condition, well then healing bleeding hearts isn't just a fun poetic metaphor, it is the absolute prerequisite for any kind of sustainable societal growth. So this brings us to a really clear working definition we can pull from her insights.
Poetry for global development is the strategic and intentional use of uplifting language to bring about peace, shared prosperity, and sustainable development. She's taking poetry completely out of the abstract and turning it into a tangible, actionable tool. It's all about being incredibly intentional with the language we use in our societies, in our governments, and even in our daily interactions, recognizing that this language is the very foundation upon which our shared prosperity is built.
To make this even clearer, she establishes a firm, no-nonsense boundary regarding the language we accept in our public discourse. On one side, she places words that demean human potential and enslave. On the flip side, she places words that actively cultivate peace and shared prosperity, the words she defines as good for sustainable development. And she views this as a binary choice. The language we use either degrades our collective potential or it elevates it. There's just no neutral ground here when it comes to the impact of our words on society.
This binary choice leads to what I think is one of her absolute most powerful concepts, the birth table of words. She argues, quite forcefully, that negative, demeaning language that enslaves should never even make it to the birth table. Think about that metaphor for a second. A birth table is where things are brought into existence. Whether it's a new law, a new corporate strategy, or a new cultural norm, it all starts as an idea born from words. She is basically pleading with us to act as gatekeepers at that birth table, ensuring that only language promoting human potential and peace is allowed to breathe its first breath into our world. So we've seen how Oluyomi Oladevid powerfully connects the dots between the poetry we speak and the global development we actually achieve. Whether you are drafting a massive policy brief, writing a quick email to a colleague, or just having a casual conversation, you are contributing to the culture of our shared prosperity. So as we wrap up this explainer, I leave you with her implicit challenge. What words will you bring to the birth table today? Will they demean or will they develop? Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you in the next explainer.